everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. We're happy to have you this evening, and we're bringing back a longtime friend, Mr. Michael Lowry, who is now at FEMA. Last time you talked to, we had Michael on, and you guys saw him on our program. I think he was working for the Weather Channel, so we're going to talk a little bit about that transition and a lot more as we head into the hurricane season. Michael working with FEMA now. We're going to talk about being prepared and just how FEMA is deployed throughout the hurricane season and all the things that they are doing to help out the community. So we hope that you enjoyed tonight's show. As always, you can submit those questions to us via our Facebook page on Facebook Live, YouTube, or on Twitter, and we'll be sure to get those questions answered for you. So, Michael, welcome back to the show. We're happy to have you. And first question, since it's been a long time, maybe we have some new followers here. We'd like to know a little bit about your weather journey. How did you get interested in the weather?
I think probably like most meteorologists, it's hard to remember. It's hard to think of a time where I wasn't interested in the weather. Actually, my first recollection of a weather event that really got me into it was I'm originally from New Orleans. In 1989, I was 7 years old, and we had a big snow event down in the New Orleans area. And most of the South saw, sort of record temperatures, low temperatures and snowfall. And I thought that was just the coolest thing. And then a few years down the line, Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida and then came up toward Louisiana, and my family and myself evacuated for that hurricane. And I think it was, at the end of the day, it was probably Hurricane Andrew that got me into the weather. And once Andrew came along, I wanted to know everything there was to know about hurricanes, from not just the meteorology, but understanding like, why are we evacuating? At what point are those decisions being made? And this is, as in 1992, as a budding teenager kind of thinking about these things. And I was just, as a kid fixated on the Weather Channel, looked to people like John Hope back then and Bill Gray. And even as a teenager wrote, actual, handwritten letters to these gentlemen, and they wrote me back and sort of directed me in the path that I've taken. And, since then it's been a really fun career that I've had from, I kind of started with, I went to school, to graduate school, and then state emergency management in Florida, 2004, 2005, very busy hurricane seasons. And then went up to Washington, D.C. and worked up for the Department of Defense for a few years before going to the Hurricane Center and working primarily with the Storm Surge group down there, and then heading to the Weather Channel, and then from the Weather Channel, going back into a little bit of research, but also working with FEMA on some projects, and then ultimately landing where I am right now, which is with FEMA, specifically here in Atlanta with Region 4, and they cover the southeastern United States.
Now you're in FEMA now, so tell us, from your perspective, what you do. What is FEMA in your position? Like, what do you do with them?
Right. So what my main role, I have a few hats with FEMA, but my main role during, as they would say at FEMA, blue skies, so when there's not a disaster happening, is I'm responsible for our disaster planning. There's several types of disaster planning. There's what they call deliberate planning, which is the sort of planning that we do outside of when there's a big disaster that's happening. And then crisis action planning, which is the planning that goes on after a disaster hits. So that's specific to the disaster at hand. And we cover, in terms of my position, I cover everything. It's not just hurricanes, but most of what we do at FEMA Region 4 is hurricanes. I mean, 80% of the support that we provide to states, state governments and local governments is hurricane related. So that is our bread and butter. It's the primary reason I'm with FEMA Region 4. And if you like hurricanes, there's really not a better place to be. Although you could argue FEMA Region 6, which is Texas and Louisiana, they've had their fair share of hurricane hits in recent years. But we do cover things like in the Southeast U.S., you all might be familiar with this, but there's the New Madrid seismic zone. There's the potential for earthquakes in South Carolina. So there's earthquakes, severe weather, winter weather, and then kind of a smattering of other things. We've obviously this year had a heavy hand in the COVID response and the pandemic. So we do biological and even if need be terrorism if it were to happen.
You spoke about Region 4. Let's talk about regions a little bit. And you mentioned the different kinds of disasters. So how are the regions broken down per disaster per se?
Mm-hmm. There's 10 regions in FEMA. And the easy way to remember it is you start with one in the Northeast and you kind of work your way down the Eastern Seaboard. Region 3 is the Mid-Atlantic, and then Region 4 is the Southeast. And you kind of work your way back to the West, and Region 6 is Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, all the way out to the Region 9, which is out in California, and Region 10, which is the Pacific Northwest area. So those are kind of how the regions geographically are broken down. In terms of population, our region is the most populous of the 10 FEMA regions. We serve about 64 million people. It's a lot of people in the states that we serve. And there are 8 states that are included in our region. So it's Florida, which is the biggie, and then all the way to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee.
Well, let's talk about our next topic, FEMA responses. What justifies a FEMA response to a disaster? What is the criteria for it?
In terms of a FEMA response, there's different layers of response, I guess, if you will. There is the traditional Stafford Act presidential disaster declaration, in which case there is following a disaster, there is what they call preliminary damage assessment. So we go out and we look at, so what is the damage that occurred? And then the states decide, the governor of the states decide whether or not they want to request for disaster assistance. That is then sent through FEMA, and a recommendation is sent to the president. And then the disaster is, if the recommendation is made and the president declares the disaster, then that sort of opens a spigot, if you will, for federal monies to begin to flow to the state. Not just the money, but the stuff and the resources and the teams and that sort of thing. In terms of, though, what we do on activations, it can vary quite a bit. Generally speaking, when you get to the level of FEMA, the federal response, it tends to be like these really big time catastrophic events that we're involved in. We do participate in events outside of what you would think of as being disasters. So if there is a Super Bowl, for example, like we had this past year in Tampa in our region will spin up to support the efforts, the crisis management or the consequence management side of that effort. Things like political conventions, so the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, if they are held in our region, then we'll support those efforts. But in terms of the weather impacts, we have a group within our building that specifically is dedicated toward determining whether or not we would need to activate for a certain disaster. And it's not really a cut and dry thing. It's not simply based on, if we expect a big, typically if there's a big tornado outbreak, we'll expect it will be activated. But for tropical cyclones, for example, it's not based on wind alone. We kind of look at it in its entirety, what the potential impacts would be. And then also it depends on the states. Some states kind of look to the federal government for support. And sometimes, depending on the state, they may have what they need to support the disaster. And they say, we're not seeing that our resources are going to be tapped or that our capabilities may be exceeded. So we're not going to need the support from FEMA. So we kind of stand down. Like I said, generally it's the big hurricanes, the big tornado outbreaks. We have a smaller footprint for, kind of the one-off events. If you have, a tornado that affects a certain community, we may send in, some assistance teams. But as a region, usually you don't see us really spin up until you get these big hurricane type events.
For a family that might be impacted by a disaster and the post-disaster response from FEMA, what might it look like for that family to receive assistance from FEMA?
I think the biggest things that families will see from FEMA is what we call individual assistance. So, the sort of grants for disaster assistance that can help you to rebuild in the wake of a disaster. Rental assistance, that sort of thing. If you need temporary sheltering, temporary housing, there are tremendous benefits to families from the agency. But I would say, generally, what we try to tell people is, the federal government is kind of your last line of support, right? It's best if you can be self-sufficient, if you can get your insurance ahead of time, if you can make sure that your home is sturdy. The sort of support in terms of financial support that you may get from FEMA, if your house is completely destroyed, is not going to pay to rebuild your house. It's not that sort of. I don't know what the numbers are now in terms of the maximum grants that you can get, but it's probably on the order of $30-something thousand, and that's maximum. And most people don't see that; they see $7,000, $8,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, which is helpful. But again, you really don't want to rely on FEMA to come in and to provide that assistance that you might need to completely rebuild. I mean, they're there to support the families, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to message to people is we want the individual to prepare in advance, to make sure that they have a plan, that they have the insurance that they need, and then FEMA will be there as best it can. But, it's when you're talking these monumental catastrophic hurricanes, there unfortunately is just not enough money to give out to everybody. If we all wish there was, but there are a lot of support mechanisms through FEMA. Like I said, not just in terms of the finance, but in terms of some of the medical assistance teams that go out and are on the ground helping folks. Making sure that if people are displaced, that they have a place to go.
But for those families that find themselves in the unfortunate situation that they do have to rely on the federal government for those grants, how would they start that process? Is there a website you go to submit an application? Yeah,
there. Typically, what happens is after a disaster, that there are teams that are sent out on the ground, and they actually go door to door, for people that are left behind, and help people register. There are. Usually FEMA's on the ground, and they're messaging, hey, this is where you need to go to register for this type of assistance. And for those who are unable to register, we do have those teams that go out with iPads and laptops and such, and we'll help people get the registration that they need and start that process. So it's not, we don't just leave it on the survivor to try to figure out where to go. That's part of the teams that are sent out in the wake of a disaster, is to make sure that the information is getting to the survivor, that they know where to go. If they're able to do it on their own, they can certainly do that. But there are people there that will, teams on the ground that are there to support people that are displaced.
So how did COVID impact your operations during hurricane season? I mean, we had some pretty catastrophic landfalls.
We did. This year was so interesting for a number of reasons, right? We did have coronavirus in the background the entire season. I remember back in March, it was my last real travel before everything went into lockdown. It was early March. I went up to New York to give a keynote talk to the Northeastern Storm Conference that's put on by the students up in Vermont, Northern Vermont University, Linden State. And part of my talk was about, our preparations going into hurricane season and really having to think about how coronavirus could affect the hurricane season. And I remember talking to a lot of people afterwards, and I think it came across as kind of being crazy. Like there's no way this coronavirus is going to go all the way. The pandemic's going to go all the way into August, September, and October. But it did. And it certainly went longer than that. One of the interesting things about the progression of coronavirus is that some of our lowest case numbers just happen to coincide with the peak months of the hurricane season. If you go back and look at the deaths and the cases, it wasn't as low as at maybe at the very start, but it was kind of right at the low point. And then once the November and the holidays came around, you saw the case numbers really dramatically take off. And even now we're just, I think, maybe starting to get below that late summer, early fall minimum in terms of the cases. So, I say we I want to say we lucked out because, there's everything about this year has been really just terrible between not only the hurricane season, but also, people and the suffering with the pandemic. But I think, had those case numbers been what they were in late November and December, and folks evacuating and a lot of people moving, it would have even worsened some of the issues that we saw during the hurricane season. In terms of FEMA and how it impacted us, we really did have a much more scaled down. I don't want to say scaled down. We had to sort of be flexible in how we coordinated our teams. So we didn't typically with a big catastrophic hurricane landfall, you would see a completely packed emergency operations center. We call the Regional Response Coordination Center, the RRCC. We only brought in the people that we needed to have in person. I was there in the RRCC, a select group of other federal agencies, but we had to be very careful with our staffing. We didn't want to overstaff. The incident management teams, some of that support was virtual just by necessity, because a lot of the times the teams that go out on the ground are embedded within the state emergency operations centers, and the state EOCs were limited in the capacity. And some of these EOCs were requiring that personnel were tested before they were to enter the EOC. So there's all sorts of things that came along with our response to with the ongoing response to coronavirus in terms of how we deployed personnel and how we responded this hurricane season. I was impressed, though. I was very impressed with the way everything was handled, and I think that speaks to the planning efforts that went on in the springtime that we conducted with our federal partners to make sure everybody was in sync. And it's not ideal, I'll say that. I mean, I think at the end of the day, for response operations to really hum, it's good to have people sort of all together in that central command place. FEMA is kind of like the big switchboard, if you will, connecting the different departments. And it's much easier when you're face to face with your other federal agencies in coordinating a lot of these efforts. But given that's kind of how we had to work through it, I thought generally our response efforts went pretty well, went pretty smoothly.
Michael, I know while being at FEMA, you have got a task ahead of you where you are redesigning the hurricane response plan. I know it's worded differently within the FEMA aspect, but you're pulling resources from local, state, federal, and even private sector partners. Can you tell us a little bit about that and some of the work you're doing with that? Yeah,
that's right now in terms of my day-to-day job, that consumes most of my time. We're kind of on a 3 to 5 year cycle with most of our disaster response plans. And we just kind of happened in this year to hit upon our hurricane response plan. And we're redeveloping that plan, not entirely from scratch, but it's a really heavy lift. The plan that exists now, these are weighty plans. Like these are 600-page plans that involve everybody in terms of the input. Like I said, all of the federal partners that would be a part of our activations are involved. All of our state partners, the state directors, down to the state planners, the private sector, the Red Cross, you name it. So there's probably 60, 70 people that are on our planning team. And so I'm leading the effort, and we're about, I would say roughly 60% in terms of plan completion. And it's a really interesting process to go through the whole thing, because it's about a year long. We started in September of last year. So we actually started during the hurricane season. There's no easy way of doing this. Inevitably, it's going to bump up against hurricane season. You just kind of have to pick where you want your bookends to be. But we have so many of these big meetings and discussions with all of our partners, and you just learn a lot in getting with other people, because everybody comes at the plan with a different perspective, and the input is invaluable. We couldn't put these plans together without the contributions from our partners. And while I might be leading the effort, it's really everybody else that's part of this. And I mean, even the Weather Service, the National Hurricane Center, is on our planning effort too. So we're at the end of the day, what we're looking to do is to improve our response plans, to make us more efficient, to accelerate the resources and that sort of thing that the states and the local governments might need in the event that there's a catastrophic hurricane impact.
You mentioned that there are a lot of different disciplines represented within FEMA. For example, you said there were 60 to 70 people working on the hurricane plan. In recent years, the Weather Enterprise has sort of in general recognized the need to consult with social scientists to better relate the weather and its impacts to the public. How much of this are you seeing at FEMA now? And do you spend a lot of time working with the social scientists and planning efforts, and also maybe even during emergency operations?
The Weather Service, I would say, was kind of ahead of the game in terms of bringing in the social scientists. But we absolutely, have people that are looking at kind of those social aspects and the social questions, especially in terms of gathering a lot of the after action reviews that happen in the wake of hurricanes involve those type of folks. So I guess not directly, I would say we don't typically have the social scientists as part of the planning teams, although I think that's a really great idea to consider, for future planning efforts. But typically it's more of the tactical side, if you will, I guess, in terms of how we're going to execute and how we're going to get the logistics to people more quickly, and less of, a lot of the social stuff goes into, like things like hurricane evacuation planning. So when you look to the hurricane program at FEMA, that's where you see a lot of the social science really engaged in terms of determining what people are doing in response to the calls for evacuations. And so it's embedded within the plan. But on our response planning teams, you don't see actual social scientists typically, but they're definitely part of our kind of whole community effort.
I just had a quick question kind of about the collaboration and working with NOAA and the USGS when you're anticipating these events and expecting floods and water related issues to these communities. What type of flood modeling are you working with, and how do you prepare for that type of devastation? And
the flooding, I think that has kind of bubbled up as one of the when I say flooding, there's kind of total water, but I'm especially thinking about the rainfall and the river flooding. That's something that we have chased a lot in recent years with these big hurricanes. I'm thinking especially about Hurricane Florence, and the nature of floods really changes our timetables for response. Typically, the way it works is we kind of spin up 5, 6, 7 days before hurricane impact, before the onset of tropical storm force winds. Storm comes through, and then, within a few days, we're beginning to transition to what they call the incident level. So we open up a field office in the state, and at the region, we kind of power things down, but we go back to sort of steady state. With the flood events, it can go on for, and we saw that with Hurricane Florence. It's difficult because, as you all know, pinpointing we have pretty good skill in terms of knowing, broadly speaking, where the heaviest rainfall will be, but pinpointing where the flooding is going to occur and the footprint and, just the nature of the way the water spreads is, it's almost impossible to do that with precision days in advance. And that's the sort of thing that we ultimately need to make for a better response. For example, if certain roads are going to be washed away, we're not going to be able to get the resources that we need to the states and to people that need it in enough time. We have isolated community issues where communities get cut off, and so we have to airlift resources to those communities. So we're working hand in glove with the National Weather Service. I've been over numerous times to the National Water Center in Tuscaloosa and working with those folks there. And, they're just kind of starting with their national water model. But I think you're going to see here in a few years where we're going to, I think, have a lot of good decision type information that we can then begin to weave into what we do in emergency management. I'm on some of these advisory panels in terms of NOAA and the USGS, and making sure again that you have these different federal agencies that are talking to one another, so that the scientists kind of understand what the decision makers are looking for, and the decision makers also understanding the capabilities of the science. There are a lot of products that just float around out there, and so it is our goal to only use those products that for the decisions that they're intended to be used for. And so much of that is in the kind of the off season when there's not a hurricane or not a catastrophic flood event going on, that we're out, talking to the scientists to understand what all of these different products are telling us.
We have Michael Lowry with us. He is a FEMA strategic planner for Region 4, which includes us here in the Carolinas. And make sure that you check out our Patreon page. We'd love for you to subscribe to that. There's different tiers, and those different tiers give you additional options. And we look to expand our Patreon page this year and give you a little bit more access to some things that we do. So we'd love for you to check that out as well. So thank you all for watching. We certainly appreciate it. Have a good night.